So, John, it's nice to see you again.
Pleasure to be back.
So, John and I met on the Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance meetup group. And, John, you've been there since the first chapter, or very close to the first chapter?
Chapter 4 was when I came on. I was commenting a little bit on your videos, and you had invited me over to the group, and that's been a fantastic experience.
Yeah, it's really fun, isn't it? We're up to chapter 17. So, you want to talk a little bit about your interest in Pirsig and what brought you to the group? Or maybe to my channel first and then to the group.
Sure. Well, my interest in Pirsig started around 2002, 2003 when I was in college. And being a hobbyist in the automotive and motorcycle world, and a student taking, at that time, I was initially majoring in philosophy. And so I was just gravitated to the title. And it did take me, I think, 3 attempts at that time to make it through the book. And like, like a lot of young people who, are encountering a whole framework of ideas that they're just not familiar with. The book, has this arc that takes you from very direct narrative storytelling into kind of a deeper and deeper level of abstraction. And, I went to a public high school and a public university. And so for me, without any background or any sort of tour guide on that adventure into the book, you would just get to a certain point where it started to, feel a little disconnected from the reality. And then as I took more, philosophy classes and communication classes and spent more time in the university environment with other literature, then I was able to reapproach the book and actually not just to make it through the book and try to understand what it was saying, but my interaction with the text was simultaneously changing my relationship with the university that I was in at the time. And like when you have seen something, that you can't unsee, when you start to see how the university maybe has a dual function. And in one function, it is there expanding your mind, and it's showing you all these things you haven't seen. At the same time, it may be focusing your attention in one direction, and it may serve to kind of blot out or exclude some paths that your mind might wander down. And I feel like Pirsig was illustrating that in the book. The double-edged sword of sort of this liberal arts education, but also this whole church of reason and rationality that had very specific rules and an embedded value structure. And so if you're in the university, you're tacitly agreeing to go along with the embedded value structure of a sort of a rationality which claims to be disconnected and separate from the human experience, and that carries itself as though it were completely objective from the experience of the individual who's maybe employing the rationality. And so now, fast forward, sorry, long introduction, but fast forward till now, in these very turbulent times that we find ourselves in, I think most people agree that that a lot of it started in 2016 with the Brexit and the political upset in the United States, and that the Jordan Peterson phenomenon on the internet. There's just wave after wave after wave of tumultuousness. Then the pandemic hits. And so for myself, at least, I found myself kind of taking a deep breath and trying to step back and look at, okay, what's the road that we've been down here as an adult? And let's kind of poke our head up to the highest mountaintop we can and survey the territory and see if we can make sense of, you know, what exactly is going on right now in this era of this hyper fragmentation, where we're all kind of in our own little silos. And so for me, going back to the book, coming to your channel, was just a way to kind of go back to the beginning and say, like, wait a minute, what are some of these systems of thinking that I've been employing, and what are the premises that I'm operating from? And maybe this can help me understand more clearly, you know, what forces are actually at work in this like very chaotic environment.
Mm-hmm. It almost sounds like your academic experience, it's almost as if you were experiencing the same thing as Pirsig in a way.
I think that there's
like maybe it was mapping onto you somehow.
I think that's a phenomenon that happens with literature.
Mm-hmm.
When you read literature, you see yourself sometimes doing what the character does, or identifying with how the character feels, and there certainly was so much commentary on what happens in a university, and I think maybe the one thing I identified with most strongly with Pirsig was this sense of wanting a real university, a sort of going into a learning environment completely open to all of the options on the table, and a free sort of discussion of all the possibilities of the universe. And then any real university would be willing to discuss, you know, any perspective or any philosophical orientation, and then be able to bring forth your evidence and your arguments and show the merits and the weaknesses. And so coming from a high school program, you know, public high school in Idaho, there was a real aspiration that when I get to the university, we'll finally get some of this real open environment for this academic, you know, discussion. And then I was a little let down to get there and feel that things were a little robotic, things were a little canned, things were not as open. And there was more or less just a map of, you know, things you check off, and then you get your certification at the end of the coursework. And that kind of emptiness that Pirsig describes,
Mm-hmm.
trying to teach that way, and how meaningless that feels to the professor. And in fact, one of my favorite professors in college quit 2 years after I graduated, out of the same exasperation that Pirsig was feeling. Just this sense of no real discovery going on, and maybe a lack of transcendence, and everything just being very rote.
Mm-hmm.
And so she left, which this is going to tie right into our other topic, which is agriculture.
Yeah.
She quit the university and started an organic farm.
Makes sense.
So I don't know if that's maybe a time you want to transition a little bit into that other topic.
Yeah, let's talk about what started this conversation between us, which is you sent me that article on permaculture and biodiversity, and you had a particular line in there that I can't quite remember, but it was really good.
If I remember correctly, they're talking about, you know, biodynamic farming,
Mm-hmm.
and that farming kind of as an art form, and that there's art infused in the farming. It's like a practice in the same way that like it's a form of worship, and that the shapes change, but the essence of the art doesn't change. So the plants, and the seasons and the animals and all the systems at play in a very dynamic agricultural environment, all have this, this element of art of farming.
So there's like an emergence to it rather than a top-down planning.
Yeah.
And that makes a lot of sense.
And, we were, Pirsig's obvious issue is that he's presenting is this quality, this integration of quality. And I saw that in the, it's the same pattern that is pervading almost every domain. And in some domains, the pattern is the majority. And in some domains, the pattern is the minority. And in religion, I think we see the pattern that I'm referring to as in the majority, which is an integration of all the levels of your life, all in accordance. And maybe I would explain to a non-religious person, that that every action is, A, form of worship, and then B, an opportunity to be pleasing to the gods or God, or to be consonant with the good or the greater good. So in farming, you have all of this commercial agriculture. My father's an organic farmer, and so he's been educating me my whole life in
now, is that his profession? Is that his full-time profession?
It's always been a secondary profession, probably his passion project. And then he had a civil service job in addition to that.
And on the farm, did you get most of your meals at home from that farm?
We did sort of market gardening for farmers markets, and we produced most of our own vegetables, did a lot of canning, and then supplement, from the grocery store. Like we weren't producing our own grains or our own livestock. But
all the produce.
Most of the produce.
That makes a lot of sense.
And so just as an example of the pattern, in agriculture, you have a very simple to follow map of how to run a commercial farm and which seeds to use, which fertilizers to use, what quantities, when to spray. And then there are, local extension offices of the agricultural departments, which kind of lay that out for you. And then you have this other pattern, that you see in the biodynamic farming, which is a, kind of farming it's good for you, it's good for your children, it's good for your family, it's good for your neighbors, it's good for the wildlife, it's good for the livestock, and it's good, it's a naturally sustaining participation in the ecosystem. And that kind of, alignment at every level was what stood out to me in the article that I was sending to you, that these people are sensing it in the same way that, in the same way that in the, like I was suggesting, the banking industry, that you have certain schools of thought in economics that, that the kind of people who believe in a gold standard so that people can very predictably save their earnings for the next generation, and that there's a consistency and that things don't get manipulated or inflated, or, the big, within the domain, there is a high order, integrated worldview that says, well, if we do money in monetary systems in the way that we do this biodynamic agriculture, in the way that we do moral decision making within the context of the family under the umbrella of a church, that all of these kind of have this same same mapping or same meta pattern, and that what I just as a witness, I'm not an expert, but just as a witness, it seems like this is a very common phenomena in the minority of the human population that is kind of beckoning the majority or the whole to kind of join together in an integrated way of life.
Yeah.
And that's a perpetually seems to be a minority. But then you have these circumstances where, like with the Christ and the value system of self-sacrifice that Christ sort of introduces into the collective conscious, that although Christ dies, some time goes on, and actually the value systems seem to seep their way and permeate the whole group, even though at the time the whole group didn't immediately subscribe. What's your thoughts on?
Well, that's interesting because that does kind of remind me. Are you have you read Lila, or do you know about it?
I read Lila right after, but again, it's been so many years, so I'm waiting for the next book club to read.
Yeah, after this one. Well, I mean, because what you're describing, these different levels, and you're seeing this pattern. That things operate on these different levels simultaneously.
Yeah,
that's what I understood.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the basis of the philosophy in Lila. Along with the dynamic, static quality that's emerging in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, this evolutionary level thing's introduced as the centerpiece of the philosophy. And so I think that's interesting what you're saying about seeing this pattern. Are there any other places you've seen it?
Well, you see it. I think you see it in energy. People who are interested in like renewable energy, what they're, without diverting into a rabbit hole on energy forms, you could include nuclear energy to make it more broad. But you certainly have, a sense of integration. Like, can we find energy sources which we can exploit in a safe way that's good for us, good for the children, good for the family, good for the neighbors, good for, the 10th generation from now. I think you see it in building and construction. There's I may get the country wrong, but if it's Sweden or Switzerland, they have a model of house building where instead of using a lot of toxic products, they use solid wood, and they sort of laminate all these layers of boards glued together with dowels, so that the walls are actually, rather than a bunch of insulation and fiberglass and formaldehyde, it's just layer after layer of solid wood, and that these houses actually insulate very well when you use that much material. Eventually, they'll completely biodegrade into the earth. And if you do have a fire, because the wood's so thick, they're actually very slow to burn.
Right.
So you're
really thinking ahead.
Somebody's thinking like, how can I build this house where they're not even using nails or everything is a natural material that would last for hundreds of years, and then if when it's time to walk away from it, it doesn't leave a mess for somebody else to clean up.
Well, it's interesting the way you articulated it. Remember when Jordan Peterson says live in a way that's good for you and your family and your community today, tomorrow, and so it's similar. It's interesting in the way you've articulated it. Really reminded me of that.
Well, I think that in the same way that people may read, the the term everlasting life in the Christian tradition in different
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah.
Saying like if you live in an integrated value system, again, I don't have a particular language developed that's exactly, just call it the pattern. If you live,
Yeah.
if you employ this pattern of behavior in every domain, then you're integrating yourself into existence in a way that would perpetuate life eternally. I mean, at least as far as we know it can go. But,
And do you think that eternally? Do you think that means something like because you're living in the moment, time stands still? Do you think eternity means that?
I don't have a strong opinion or certainty about it. I mean, I think there's in the Gospel of Thomas, the quote, the kingdom of heaven is all around us or something, but man cannot see it. And I think that kind of alludes to a little bit of what you're saying, that in a way you stand outside of time, like or Eckhart Tolle, kind of in that power of now, that if you're in the moment, you actually are, like time does not really matter, and then there really is only the now. So at the risk of, just repeating a bunch of sort of stereotypical or cliche at this point comments, I mean, they're kind of cliche for a reason.
Yeah, because they're meaningful.
They're all pointing, the same direction.
Yeah,
at least that's
absolutely
how I see it. Where I'm at, and so there's this, that's where I've been this year, is sort of pulling back, trying to get the 50,000 feet view, and you go like, wow, there's this kind of pattern, and you see it in all these different domains, and I think, I don't want to go into it, but I mean, you see it in, I think both of the political tribes are actually have their own kind of vision of this integration.
Yeah.
And so they're exercising the pattern differently. And the two tribes are having a very hard time communicating about it or understanding someone else's system. And that's obviously become kind of the gorilla in the room, is this seemingly insurmountable stuckness.
Yep, they're looking in the wrong place. They're looking at the manifestation of the pattern and not the pattern itself, and they don't realize. So that's interesting.
Yeah, you get stuck on one action. If you're so focused on a little action, and then A or B, and tribe A picks A, tribe B picks B, and then there's this endless argument over that, instead of saying like, well, what's the intention to integrate? Because I believe both tribes are looking at situation A or B in their attempt to integrate to the highest, the highest value.
That's right.
And what's your take on that? I mean, if you're seeing this stuckness, without, like, what transcends that?
Well, it's interesting because right before we got on, I was reading. Now you're reading "Sovereignty of the Good" by Iris Murdoch, right? Is that the one? It's interesting in there because she's saying there's this pattern, like focusing on the highest good, and what you're saying is, if for this half of the tribe the highest good is this, then the whole structure is going to look different versus the structure of this side. So when you look at the structure, they're going to look very different, but the mechanism of getting up to the highest good is the same. So the interesting thing about what this Iris Murdoch, I looked on Wikipedia, is saying is it seems like she's kind of saying the same thing. Is that is there a secular, a secular substitute for God? And then she goes through the good and the Plato thing. And that is kind of, I mean, it does have something in common with Zen. and in the
Mm.
art.
Well, she points out the other domain. You know, we were talking about agriculture or building or farming. You know, she points that out in art, which is, I think, your field, previous field of expertise, and that if you're creating art, I had a high school theater teacher. He used to say, you know, you have to see the art in yourself, not yourself in the arts. If you see yourself in the arts, you know, you're probably not going to be a great artist. And Murdoch kind of points that out, that if you're painting, you know, to be a great, well-known, famous painter, you know, it's very unlikely that the art is going to transcend.
And that's exactly, you know, what you put at the top of your hierarchy is where, you know, is where you're headed towards.
Yeah, I mean, you could even, I have a friend, he's a public defender. So there's, you know, a lot of different kinds of lawyers in the world. But he went into the law explicitly with the intent of becoming a public defender, thinking that, you know, there are people out here who have really just had a bum start in life. And here they are at 17 or 19 or 20 years old, a lot of them, and just making some stupid mistake. And then not really having, you know, anyone to properly advocate, you know, and to really not just properly advocate in the courtroom, but, you know, part of, I think, his vision of what the law would be is that as a lawyer, as a defense attorney, you're recognizing the divine human element in the client and their deservedness, you know, to be represented. And so not just that the lawyer shows up and maybe makes the argument, but that the lawyer treats the client who they are representing as though they are a living being worthy of that dignity. Just another, you know, just one more domain where the same pattern comes up, you know, and we see this, everybody likes this. You know, when we see a movie, you know, Erin Brockovich, you know, what's she doing? She's worried about these people getting sick and poisoned, you know. She's not there because she wants a Rolls Royce. You know, there's an integration, and it's clear that we all love this story. We're all on this side, but it's totally ambiguous, you know, what the mechanism. I definitely think that, I think our connection with Jonathan Pageau's work, you know, is highlighting that without that collective religion bringing all of the different elements together and then pointing them out of themselves in unison towards the good, in theory, that we're just fragmented, you know, and a lot of people. That sounds like there's a judgment in there, but just a sense of disorientation.
No, absolutely. I mean, everyone's feeling it, you know.
Atomization.
Absolutely.
Children with all of their anxiety problems, and you know, this is. I think that Jonathan always, you know, he lays out very clearly, like this is reality. This is not metaphor. That if you choose to kind of lie to yourself and you just pretend that these rules don't apply, and really the outcome that we're seeing in Western society right now is the result of kind of not being honest with ourselves.
Yeah, and that being honest with ourselves, I think, is something that runs through all this as well. Because, you know, it's just that lining up, that harmonic feeling inside of yourself, that what you're saying is genuine. And you can't, like, if you're really listening to yourself and your body, it is going to tell you the truth.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And certainly when Jordan Peterson says that at the basis of his approach is to tell the truth, I think that's, that's that same kind of thing lining up with, that in the moment approach to motorcycle maintenance that we see in Zen.
Yeah,
this almost worshipful connection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely see that. His whole description of the the mechanics who are not wanting to work.
Mm-hmm.
They really want to listen to music, maybe have some beer and hang out. That's what they really want to be doing. But they sort of need to pay the rent, and
Mm-hmm.
they maybe have a kid they got to feed. So they will work on your motorcycle even though they don't really want to.
Mm-hmm.
And then they'll sort of turn the music up loud and try
Mm-hmm.
to be somewhere else while they're doing it. And then they don't care about your motorcycle. They don't see the connection between their work and serving the other human who's going to be putting their life on
Mm-hmm.
this motorcycle. And then errors, start happening, damage occurs. And essentially you end up with a dissatisfied customer. You end up with a poorly or improperly assembled motorcycle. You have a motorcycle mechanic who ends up losing the customer and eventually
Mm-hmm.
goes bankrupt. So it's the inverse of
Yep.
Peterson's rule.
Yeah.
It's like, it didn't work for you, it didn't work for your kids, it didn't work for your coworkers,
Right.
It didn't work for your customer, it didn't work for whoever
Mm-hmm.
else was out on the road with that person whose machine fell apart and caused an accident. So that yet another domain,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
the same pattern. And
But I think so the pattern is headed toward either truth or non-truth. Is that what you would say?
I don't know if
Well, let's say that unraveling, let's see the knitting up to the highest good for everyone and your community, et cetera. And then the unraveling going down. Wouldn't the thing that would take you towards the good, wouldn't that be the truth of Peterson? And then if there's a falsehood or a lie, that would be sin, that would be missing the mark.
I
mean, there's something about these two words, I think, that kind of, I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I definitely agree that you are not going to integrate if you're trying to use lies to get there. And I mean, I would challenge anyone I know, to consult your own life and think yeah, maybe you've told some lies that you got away with. And maybe you benefited from some of those lies. But now you have the guilt of being the thief or being the, the fraudulent actor or being the liar. And now you're going to suffer, most of us have a conscience.
Mm-hmm.
We have a sense of self. And so then maybe you're called to do something brave. And it's time to stand up and do something very brave that's going to be, unfortunately, very public. And then you think, oh, I can't do that because, gosh, I told these lies a while ago. And if this attention comes on me, that stuff can surface out. And then, all those lies I got away with.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay, so now I'm caught. I'm going to do the brave thing, and those lies are going to come out of the darkness and swallow me.
Mm-hmm.
And I will then now suffer for that dishonesty.
Mm-hmm.
Or I don't do the brave thing, and now I live in a corrupt world because I'm unable to stand up uprightly and advocate for the just, because out of fear of my personal destruction. So then I also live in a world where the dishonesty yields me living in a form of kind of a hellish environment internally.
Yeah.
And I think that's the truth, that or the element that Peterson's talking about with truth,
Yeah.
you start being dishonest and lying, or lying to get your edge in your, for advantage in business, or to get your policies pushed through in the government, or, you're lying to your partner for personal greed reasons, that there is no getting away with it.
Mhm.
And
Well,
you're just planting these awful, seeds.
well, the thing is, it works, you know? I mean, it works in terms of these material gains and and getting your way politically, getting your way financially. And so it's just, it's such a unique experience, I think, to get that kind of sensibility that you'd want to go in the direction of truth. Because it means that whole, and it's a lot of our culture is this whole fantasy of a certain kind of success. And it's really hard to extract oneself from that, and have faith that like we get the sensibility, if we're not pursuing that, then we're going in the opposite direction. And there's something about having to extract yourself from that and have more faith, like, consider the lilies, they're, look how beautifully they're clothed, and they didn't grasp for it. And so it's this leap of faith, I think, coming out of this box of what, the direction we're supposed to be taking.
Yeah, it's definitely a complicated sort of phenomenon, because you do have you have those issues there where you could say, well, you could cut corners or be a little dishonest in a way to get yourself ahead a little bit now. Absent of church environment and church moral instruction, maybe I'm just not aware. But I grew up in a secular family. And unless, you have a secular, say maybe Jordan Peterson father, who's going to lay that out for you about all these levels, and you got to get everything synchronized with the truth, or you're really going to undo yourself later on. Are there any other institutions or mechanisms by which people are gaining that perspective, who are able to pick up on that pattern? Because it seems like the message that, the teenagers need to know is, that if you compromise yourself now as a young person, you're just it's kind of like these people who, I'd say a bad analogy, but I use it, people who do horrible things publicly on a social media platform for their childhood or young adulthood. And then, gosh, 10, 20 years ago, some screenshots pop up of that. And whether it's the early sort of dishonesty and deception, that you don't know when you're 18 that some of those little fibs or whatever you're telling in high school means that somebody's going to be interviewing you when you're 28, and they'll think that you were the liar, from school. And that kind of pollution of your own identity, whether it's, the example where you're called to be brave and you can't because you're afraid of your skeletons in your closet coming out, or you don't even know that those skeletons exist because you don't see them, but everybody around you thinks you're kind of a lying cheat. And so then people just steer clear of you, and you don't have any, again, this is all maybe too much in the lens of that form of success, that, well, you might need these references later on, or you might need someone to give you the opportunity, but it's, you're going to need to function in the landscape of the society.
Of course, and that's your community. I mean, it's
and
not,
so,
it's your community.
And the same thing. There just seems to be the counter pattern of some overarching desire in modernity to have like an ultimate freedom of self, and a freedom of self, which I think sometimes gets verbalized as don't judge anybody else. But actually, I get the sense that these are just people who really don't want to be judged themselves. And so they're trying to use the language carefully, but that a desire to live in a world where there are not consequences for actions. So I live in a city with a lot of homeless people. Some of them are there because of a personal set of tragedies out of their control. But then a lot of them are there based on a lot of bad behavior, series of a lot of those kind of that kind of lying, deception, criminal behavior that we just described. And now they're paying the consequence. And where Peterson's saying, you got to integrate with truth so that you live a whole life as a whole dignified, intact individual, and that you're able to carry on with your family and friends and neighbors in an integrated way. Then we're looking at these people who are suffering on the streets, and there's like a desire to take away that punishment, to sort of, around here, we got to solve this homelessness problem. But I don't know that you can solve the problem of people who are criminally dishonest. And I'm, again, obvious I have to speak so carefully because this is the age that we're in. We're not saying all of these people, but we're saying that there are very nasty consequences when you lie, cheat, and steal from everybody you know. You may end up isolated in a tent on the sidewalk, and that's the consequence of being destructive to everybody in your environment. And so when we think about how do we solve this problem of like we want all these people off of the street, and part A, compassion, and part B, their presence, their lives coming completely unglued in broad daylight makes everybody totally distressed, very uncomfortable, and it's painful to watch. And but again, I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, except to say that the antithesis to that integration is kind of a ruin. The more more dishonest, I guess, and more criminal or more violent or more whatever destructive you are, the more visceral the consequences are. But we don't like to see our fellow person, lose their family and their children because they cheated on their spouse. But we don't, we can't get rid of the divorce problem. Because people are behaving, destructively. And the solution that Peterson offers is like, maybe the only solution, or Pageau, it's all in the same vein, is like, how can we kind of get the younger people in at the entry level? Because if you get them oriented as a young person, and I think this was the whole mission of the Sunday school, was get them in when they're 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 and they're stealing Susie's candy, and try to get them oriented then, because whether or not you believe in a religious tradition, this the Petersonian integration with truth is going to, that's the undeniable pattern that
that we see.
But like you were saying, some people kind of seem to, and you really highlight the word seem to get away with it. because they're, some Wall Street sleazy
Yeah.
person. But, that sometimes that comes unwound and they end up committing suicide when they get caught. And, they might have really a lot of broken families and a lot of personal despair that might be embedded that,
Yeah, no, I have no doubt that's the case. And they may be the people who will never be able to recognize it because they're in, because their material circumstances are so spectacular.
Hmm.
So that's one kind of misery. Yeah, for sure.
You just saw with the, that spectacular breakup of the richest man in the world. You could
Mm-hmm.
be the richest man in the world, and it's hard to keep the marriage together.
That's right.
It's not enough.
You certainly see that over and over again. But another thing you were touching on that made me think was, when you're talking about, these homeless people, there's like this built-in element to the pattern. And I don't know how you would characterize it. I think that Pageau characterizes it as the margin.
Mm-hmm.
Which is the unknown, but I think it's also where, the people who are outside society live. And the thing about the margin is it's always there. It's one of those constituent elements. But when I think about, there's also a place in the margin for tragedy. There's something built into the human system that is so hard to accept, but that's, the reality of tragedy that will never be alleviated. And you could say that within this band of tragedy, people sometimes come in and out, and I think that's true.
I think that's the beauty of the whole Christian message.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is the most spectacular aspect of it, in my humble opinion. And I'm not an evangelist,
mm-hmm.
but you could live in a world where we don't forgive. We could live in a world where we don't forgive you for what your parents did. We could live in a world where we don't forgive you for what some ancestor of yours did 10 generations ago, mm-hmm. and you're never permitted to separate or be mm-hmm. forgiven. But that capacity for someone on the margin who's been completely living in the wrong, mm-hmm. to just simply say, okay, I'm just going to turn around and I'm just going to walk away from that direction. And I'm going to now choose to orient myself to the good. Mm-hmm. And the rest of the group of this, of the society to say, hooray, that's so fantastic. Mm-hmm. Well, welcome back to the group. Come back to the table. Let's eat.
Right.
What a great redemptive mechanism. And we like that story too.
It almost seems like that would have to be, even, depending on how you looked at it, would have to be a constituent element of the pattern. Forgiveness.
Sure.
Or maybe it would be, let's look at it in a Pirsig sense, maybe it would be that dynamism, that thing that allows things to change. Mm-hmm. So forgiveness is for, it's like a renewal. It's like the next level in a way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I can see it also, in terms of the pendulum swing. Mm-hmm. Like there's always, society drifting from, one sort of whim to another whim, mm-hmm. or, one frame or one paradigm to another. And yeah, you have to have the pendulum swinging. Mm-hmm. And when it swings over here, you can't just kill all the people who were on the other side of the pendulum. And then when it swings back, man, they just come and, then you're just in the perpetual, war state. And I think that forgiveness mechanism alludes to that. Mm-hmm. It's like, okay, well, we're in control now. So we forgive everybody who's, mm-hmm. Trespassed, and we can, again, a lot of like the calling for unity, it's like, how do you bring in the margins we don't want to exterminate the homeless people.
Mm-hmm.
We don't really want to celebrate tragedy. But there is that just the undeniable presence of tragic consequences. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of times there's an interpretation when you bring up consequences and action, people perceive that to be a very cold, mm-hmm. unsympathetic perspective. But it can also be the consequences of the actions of very abusive people who, treated their, children in horrible ways and damaged them. And mm-hmm. they grew up completely unable to function and now are in the tent. So the people in the tent is the tragic consequence, not necessarily just of the individual in the tent, mm-hmm. but that there's no way where the behavior of those people in the previous generation just demolishing their children, that those children, there's the natural consequence to that destruction, mm-hmm. which is now the tragedy that you witness.
Yeah.
And so, the only answer, in all of the domains is some kind of like grace and some mm-hmm. some kind of forgiveness and
some kind of acceptance of some sort, an integral acceptance, maybe something like, this is to remind us where we could be.
Well, you see that at the end of Zen, mm-hmm. Where, it seems like that redemptive, or that it's in that form of forgiveness, that fetus is able to reintegrate with the mm-hmm. son. The son's not casting off the father, and he's there's this. The father's not holding grudge against the son for his misbehavior. The son doesn't hold a grudge against the father for his psychotic break and meltdown mm-hmm. and difficulties. That, really at the end you have this, again, this integration. This is mm-hmm. coming back together and the healing. Mm-hmm. And then, like the Dalai Lama, mm-hmm. Said, what is it, 7 billion people, nobody wants to have a problem. Boy, everybody has so many problems. Gee, whose fault? Where did these come from? They come from the people, but while the problems are from the people, the solutions are in the people. Mm-hmm. And there's a chaotic basket going on right now. Like, okay, so coming back to the quality, mm-hmm. right? So we identify this pattern, and we could say that, like, Jordan Peterson in his 50s?
Yeah, late 50s, yeah.
Late 50s. Mm-hmm. He's had a long life, a lot of time to figure out the pattern, and a lot of time to realize the authenticity and relevance of the pattern. So now he can speak about this pattern with authority and probably reference, a million different ways that it applies and how you just can't escape it. Mm-hmm. But because we live in this big, diverse, basket of people where some people are really damaged or broken or never had anybody even suggest that you got to tell the truth, kid. That seems like the problem that millions of people are yearning for a solution to. Mm-hmm. It's how to kind of feel at one mm-hmm. with, the society. And then the earth has gotten a little smaller mm-hmm. and there's no frontier anymore.
Yeah, that's true.
We're all explored. Every square inch is accounted for. And, mm-hmm. and I think maybe with the exception of some of Antarctica, maybe some North Pole, like
Well,
it's all
maybe
about.
that's the thing that'll push people, push people over the edge, because what we're talking about is something that is really, it's a tall order for most people. There's really a dis-ease. There's an unease to this approach. To see, let's just say, the lilies in the field approach, the telling the truth approach. This attempt to go on a straight path, not one that's been dictated to you, but one that, that the good, the quality is taking you on. And that means giving up a whole bunch of preconceived notions and certainties. And it's jarring to people.
Walk me through a little bit of what they would give up. Can you walk me through a little bit what, just so I can hear your thoughts on when it's jarring?
Well, let's just say that think of how many times a day the average person tells a white lie, or builds themselves up, or does any of a number of little dishonesties that are so imperceptible unless you're really looking for them. Mm. So it's like there's a certain way, and especially these days because we're so image oriented, there's a certain presentation quality to I guess to our social lives in a lot of ways. And so if you're talking about an approach that is completely honest and authentic, that means you have to drop a lot of that stuff. These little social niceties, and it's in a way, it's like, say all your friends, say your social life revolved around alcohol, and then you give up alcohol, and it's that same kind of thing, So
that is you're exactly describing my life. Thank you.
Well, maybe we should say, yeah, I wanted to ask you, because you've been on a really interesting spiritual journey, and I want to make sure we get that in this conversation. So would you mind going into that?
Sure. I think I just start at the main event. I bought a house. I live in Portland, Oregon, and we bought a house at the coast, which is a couple hours away. So I was driving on my weekends out to work on the house on my 3-day weekends. And I was coming back in the middle of the night, and there's a big, very high bridge. And as I'm crossing this bridge, I think I had been thinking about this pattern, maybe not as crystallized. Now I've had time, and it's always easier in the rearview mirror to sort of assess what's going on. But I think the intuition that I had was that I was not participating in the pattern. And I had heard, I think, a lot of people in the Christian tradition repeat this notion that, or this idea, that if you if you say a prayer and you invite the Holy Spirit into yourself, that there's this thing called the Holy Spirit which comes into you, and then that works inside you to orient you towards the good. And that all you have to do actually is the first step, that it won't come in and you can't get oriented without first sort of confessing the sin nature and agreeing to kind of repent and turn the other way, and to invite that into yourself. And that's a lot of words to describe sort of what was just a feeling that happened on this bridge. A sort of sense like, I've earned money, I have a wife, we have some financial independence, we could put ourselves on a plane and be anywhere in the world tomorrow. We're standing on the beach, watching the waves, saying, where do we want to go? What do we want to do with our lives? We could kind of do anything. And then this enormous sense of emptiness to realize that we don't really want to please ourselves, that just feels so completely empty. So I think it's just that conclusion of the nihilistic worldview that, I don't know if it's just nihilism. Again, I don't know if I have the total language to describe it, but essentially living in the world as it was brought to me by the people that I learned from growing up. The messages I heard in my secular world were follow your bliss, follow your passion, make yourself happy, basically don't judge others and don't be judged by others, and have an infinite level of self-esteem and confidence in who you are, regardless of really what you're doing or how bad your behavior. You're always intrinsically good. But, like the kid who's getting a trophy when he knows that he didn't even play the game and he was eating a candy bar under the bleachers, and at the end somebody, gives him a trophy, you just feel dirty about the whole thing. And that was somewhat of what was going on this, this bridge crossing. And I said, okay, something is just fundamentally not satisfying. And for thousands of years, people have said, all you have to do is just turn away from any of that dishonesty, admit that you've kind of maybe been on the wrong path, and then maybe invite a higher power in to help you, because all your friends might be alcoholics. And if you invite maybe that higher power would just be the one who helps you kind of skip that drink tonight, or maybe not tell this lie, or not get on Tinder, whatever the thing is that, people would be falling into. And so, just like I said in our previous conversation, that I decided to try to integrate that every interaction or action was a fork, and there was a good and evil. You could call it good and evil. You could call it light and dark. You could call it dishonesty and honesty, whatever. But the pattern of everything that we experience is bifurcated, and that there's a path to the good that is available. And so I opened myself up and said, boy, if I could receive a little help to make sure that when I'm going down this road that I could be pointing towards the good every time. And so the experience after that has been that has been very effective. Mm-hmm. And like many people who have these experiences, they say they are ineffable. There's some element you can describe after the fact, which is to say, like, to be vulnerable and to humble yourself. Very, very hard. Like I guess, you were just saying that to get onto that path is shattering and jarring. And so now I was in my early 30s at the time, mid 30s. So I was embedded in an entire social network of every connection, mm-hmm. which, looking back, is embedded in a lot of little dishonesties. Mm-hmm. And, we went back to the city and had dinner with a couple of friends, and they're, gay couple. They had been friends of ours for years. And I mentioned that I went to church, and we never heard from them again.
Wow.
We were just, deleted, after we had a long relationship with these folks, but that was just a deal breaker. Like, mm-hmm. we're not friends with anybody who attends church, like, for what, just a wholesale. And I thought, well, the alcoholic, if you're not drinking and they say, they invite you to the bar, you say, I'm not drinking, and they don't call you anymore. Mm-hmm. That's a little more obvious, but, that one, like a lot of people experience when you're
Yeah.
entering a phase of growth, sometimes people around you are not interested, or I don't know, not interested. I don't know if the word.
Well, I'd be interested in how you feel about them.
Oh, well, they were our friends, and I was just saying to
But
them,
now through this period of growth, how do you
oh,
feel about them now?
I don't have any ill will towards them. What do you mean? I guess how do I feel with them more
How does
specifically?
that how is this? Let's just talk about forgiveness.
Sure.
Let's just talk about how does that feel now with after this period of growth? Like, were you ever at a time where maybe you'd resent them, or they would, you'd hold a grudge against them or anything like that?
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so I think what I'm trying to get is a qualitative feel for the difference. It's really, like you said, these experiences are ineffable. So to ask for some kind of blow by both thing would,
Sure.
would be counterproductive. But I'm kind of interested in what it feels like to transform in that way.
Well, I mean, we've had several experiences with people in our social group, and it is interesting how attuned actually we all are.
Mm-hmm.
You can that yeah, I'm not sure exactly how to even break it down with our friends who
Mm-hmm.
kind of ghosted us. What I do is I think about what their life was like.
Mm-hmm.
They're a gay couple. One of the guys is from Idaho. It was from a very Mormon community, and they felt alienated and isolated by people in the church in their
Mm-hmm.
hometown.
Yeah.
So to them, when they hear that you are going to church, I can understand and intuit that means that you are hanging out with a bunch of people who maybe did terrible things and tormented them. Maybe if I had maybe a group of 20 bullies in high school who all bullied me every day,
Mm-hmm.
and then you told me that you actually hang out with those guys every Sunday and you love them. Now, there may be a whole different thing going on with what you're doing with those people on Sunday. And those bullies, there may be some other phenomenon. But to them, it's there. I recognize the validity of the trigger and the wound,
Mm-hmm.
and that they're ghosting me. I don't feel like a victim
Mm-hmm.
of the ghosting. And like being on the margin of like the homeless person or whatever, if I ran into them tomorrow and they said, oh man, we stopped calling you and gosh, that was dumb. We had a great friendship and we should pick things back up. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
There's not even a hard feeling to overcome. It's just kind of I would use the word bearing witness in a way.
Bearing witness, yeah.
Kind of getting myself integrated, and then if someone leaves, you just kind of witness it.
Mm-hmm.
And you go, oh, okay, well, there's something there.
So the way you described how one should look at the situation, right? How to make sense of a situation like that. Doesn't it, even look at the way you described it objectively, doesn't it make 100% objective sense, not even in any kind of bias or not even with any kind of character trait?
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't it make objective sense to see it that way? That the reason that they might have ghosted you, isn't the way you described the situation and how you should see the background that resulted in their behavior towards you?
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't that seem like, if you were going to describe the situation objectively and posit a reason for their behavior, doesn't it seem like this is the explanation that most people would agree made the most sense, the highest quality explanation?
Well, in my communication education, we use the term the most charitable assumption.
Mm-hmm.
And that in relationships, if you're a married couple and you
Mm-hmm.
just move into a new house and you see your partner out at the fence laughing and enjoying some good jokes with the
Mm-hmm.
neighbors, you could think, my husband is flirting with that woman. He's interested in her.
Mm-hmm.
You could go for the least charitable assumption. Or you could say, oh, that's so nice. Like, I'm so glad to see that, my husband's getting along with the new neighbors. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
We must have new neighbors. Most charitable assumption.
Mm-hmm.
And in the research on, couples who've been married for long period, 50 plus years,
Mm-hmm.
the analysis of their communication and behavior is overwhelming. They all participate in the most charitable assumption. So
Makes sense.
same thing, high quality,
Mm-hmm.
that how would you phrase that in terms of quality? Your decision to, in all those relationships, you have a lot of ways
Best
you can,
decision.
it's just,
Yeah.
I'd say, it's always the most charitable assumption that their intentions are good, or like our friends who ghosted us,
Yeah.
that, there was nothing in all of the friendship that was a problem.
Yeah.
So
It's like incomplete information if you're looking at it that way. It's like the best of intentions, but there's a certain worldview because they've had to because they can't be in touch with this other part of themselves because it's so corrupted, by their childhood. So there's no way that can ever come into the worldview as a possibility. So it's not a complete worldview. So when you've got,
creates a blind spot.
yeah, there's a blind spot. So like the way you were explaining it, there's no blind spot in there. I mean, you can call it, I think what I was noticing is when you objectively describe the situation in the way that makes most sense, in the big picture, and you might be able to say makes most sense to you and the person next to you and your community, et cetera, but still kind of lines up so it seems like reality.
Sure.
And then you make your decision of how to act based on that, the way that lined up. It seems ultimately that ends up being the most moral decision. So that this compassionate is sort of conflated. I mean, it's sort of integrated in a way.
Yeah, and I think that it's important to point out that you don't behave well to move yourself up the moral hierarchy, which I think that something I've experienced when people say interact with the church community. A lot of times they have a feeling that the others are placing themselves above them in some sort of moral hierarchy, like the stereotypical church ladies who are judging everybody's behavior and condemning them, or there's these archetypes. So with the guys that ghosted us, my goal in being open to them as individuals, as sort of, sovereign, beings in the equal creations in the world.
Yeah.
Whatever language you use to describe, the intention of that is not to one up them and to virtue signal to say like, well, I'd forgive you, but you wouldn't forgive me. But rather, I don't have a choice because I only have one choice. And the only choice I have is to treat you the way that I want to be treated. And the way I want to be treated is if I intuited that you were bad news and I walked away from you, I mean, there are people we all walk away from in our lives that we intuit are some sort of bad news. And later I discover that you're not bad news. I want you to let that go and everything will go together peacefully. So the moral imperative is I don't have a choice really in how I view those gentlemen. And so it's because I don't feel that I have a choice in how I view them, it also doesn't say anything about my character, because it's not a personal decision. If you
Yeah.
take the decision making out of yourself and say, no, I'm going to kind of follow this integrated pattern that I think works for everybody.
Yeah.
You're not advocating on your own behalf in the system, and not advocating on your own behalf in the system also doesn't make you a better person or give you a status in the hierarchy, which I think is important to spell out, because somehow that gets like kind of left out, that telling the truth and integrating yourself with the good and every fork you come to, making the right decision. Mm-hmm. That I think in the Christian teaching, it's kind of like Christ's imperative, mm-hmm. that you don't let the left hand know what the right hand's doing when you're giving away money, and you shouldn't, see who you're giving it to. And it's like, you can't do any of this behavior. You cannot participate in this way of being in a subtle, subconscious way to boost yourself up.
Right.
So then you just say, okay, I'm accepting what good is. Mm-hmm. And I'm accepting it's my responsibility to do it starting today. And so then situation comes up. Okay, how can I think of this most charitably? Mm-hmm. How would I want to be treated?
You're allowing for this approach, you're allowing for your intuition to tell you, because you've made a commitment to what's good, you've instilled that as the top of your hierarchy, and then after that, all you have to do is follow your, not all you have to do, but in general, by following your intuition in this setup, you're headed in the right direction. Is that what you're saying?
By intuition, your sense of if I explicitly ask the question, if God was watching me today in this conversation, in this challenge or decision, mm-hmm. I have to use my intuition, my imagination, and say, I'm going to imagine what would be pleasing to that God. Mm-hmm. Or some people are allergic to the word God. So you could say, if I had a loving parent that I wanted to make proud of me, and that was a very moral and just parent, mm-hmm. and I wanted to make them proud, and I was in this situation, how would I handle this fork in the road, this event, in such a way that would make them proud? Yeah. What would bring honor? And it seems like, and maybe I'm deluded in my narrow worldview. It seems like that's kind of universal, that if you ask people, what are you going to do? Well, I'm going to do A. Okay. In a thought experiment, and your choices are A, B, and C, is A the thing that would be like very pleasing to God if they were watching? Most people have a sense of if it would be or not. Mm-hmm. Whether or not they're religious. I mean, I didn't grow up in a religious background, but I have a sense of
of course.
Again, like you said, it's the gut.
Yeah.
The gut's going to tell you.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so observed and inherited that it's so true within us forever. As long as we've been conscious, I guess. I mean, not conscious, but aware, the Garden of Eden stuff.
And what do you think as far as culture? Is it culturally specific, or would that sense of what would be pleasing?
No, I was actually going to say that the way you phrase that is what would be pleasing to a loving and fair and just and nurturing parent is probably as good a substitute as you're going to get in the secular worldview. I mean, I actually think that's more compelling than a more vague, at least maybe for Western. No, I think it would be for everyone. I think it would be for everyone.
My wife's from Japan, and if I were to ask her, actually we've had this conversation because she's not religious, but when I had essentially the same conversation that we've just been having, mm-hmm. she said, "Oh, that's how I operate. Mm-hmm. I just don't call it what's pleasing to God." She's like, "But I always try to be," she calls it fair. Mm-hmm. She says, "Oh, I always try to be fair in every every single, I mean, methodically,
Yeah.
maybe it's the cultural. There's so many, such an intricate culture in Japanese society of things that behaviors and ways to behave and not to behave.
Right.
So she encounters a situation with a coworker or a boss or a neighbor and immediately reflects on, what is the right thing to do? What's fair, what's right.
Yeah. So fair occupies a very high place in the hierarchy of virtues in Japanese culture.
She uses the word fair, and I think of like something very strong with young children. You got two kids and they're fighting over a toy, and mom, that's not fair. It's like something very primal, very early is like, hey, they took my thing, or they ate my food, or they hit me, or they got punished when I didn't get punished. There's this, kind of early sense of morality in there, that's sense of fairness, like I got grounded for a week, they got grounded for a day. That's not fair. I don't, and at least for Marina, she has, very consistent application of a fairness doctrine.
And it's infused, is that kind of like, is that infused with like the highest good? I mean, is it really way up there in terms of, well, like if it's the guiding force, then it must be a sort of metaphor for the highest good. And that's an interesting thing to think about in terms of the use of.
It's always tricky when you're dealing with someone for whom your language is their second language.
Right.
Because there can be a little, like she makes the point, frequently people ask her, like what kind of faith tradition there is in Japan. She says, well, Japan's like maybe the most atheist country in the world, but it's culturally permeated with Buddhism.
Yeah, because it's like Tao. I mean, fair, it means balanced. It means in harmony. It means integrated. And that would be, that does reflect highest good. I guess it's a little more Eastern conceptualization of it, but.
Yeah, there's a sense of, maybe it's a translation thing too, because you could maybe substitute the word fairness with just. I try to do what's just. If you're just translating the word, I don't know that they're, the kids crying at the mom for the unjust, variation in punishment might, you could almost substitute those words, but fair, just is a little more gravity to it than fairness.
Yeah. So maybe that's the Abrahamic God, and maybe that's Yahweh, just, and the Christian God is fair.
And forgiving.
And forgiving.
And you got to have the forgiving in there.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else that's on?
Well, it's been a great conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, it's always stimulating. I apologize. Sometimes it is hard to articulate, some of this stuff, which is just very nebulous in our environment.
It's really hard to articulate. And I think that's why these conversations are good, is because we're trying to do it. We're trying to kind of hash it out and see what it means. And some of these concepts, when they get brought up, like now, like here's two right off the bat is fairness and forgiveness, and how like the patterns we created today can be referenced again.
Well, yeah, and that, and with that, with that sense of justice, right? Because justice and tragedy and fairness, that there is something just about suffering following, somebody doing, like, somebody goes and murders a bunch of innocent people, and then they go to jail for the rest of their life. There's a sort of tragic element of all of the waste of all their lives. So there's some tragedy there. There's some justice there as far as these people were deprived, and so then there's this, we're going to deprive this, attacker.
Yeah.
And that somehow there's fairness in there, and maybe there's capacity for forgiveness, but the forgiveness doesn't necessarily eliminate the justice or the fairness, or the tragedy doesn't get, there's just a lot of kind of the layers of the onion.
Yeah,
as
the
far
layers
as,
of the onion. Yeah, exactly. Because that's all that's occurring. That's a lot of, that justice is a social thing. It's a certain structural on the social level. Then higher on the social level is, well, forgiveness, I guess, would be more of, a dynamic updating. So, I mean, this is in Pirsig's thing. but I think what I'm trying to say is that, you're going to get something that seems kind of paradoxical, but it's because stuff is happening on every different level. Like there's stuff happening to a person on the social level. Maybe they have to go to jail for being bad, but maybe still they can be forgiven on this level, and maybe, they can be transcendent as well. I mean, they can be spiritually awakened, or they can they can improve their minds, so you can operate on all these different levels.
End up, writing some book that ends up ministering to young children that, steers them, serves as a warning, or steers them away, or.
But even if they redeem themselves there, they're still going to have to be in jail. So these things can just coexist, at the same time.
Like earlier I asked you, is there any, outside of church, environment, is there anywhere else that is describing the world and your participation in it in terms of all these nested layers? And I think it just occurs to me that that was one of the things that Peterson's lectures did, was they presented this very powerful mapping tool to people who maybe had lived their whole life without ever exposing to it, and then could at least consider it.
Yeah.
And then when you consider it, well, it's kind of compelling.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, it just speaks to that, it speaks to a reality that we already intuit, that we already feel. And then once we see it, what it is, once we have a rubric for, or heuristic, or whatever you call it, for expressing it in the world and understanding it in the world with other people, it's really quite an experience.
Yeah, I get the sense that whatever domain we're talking about this pattern sort of occurring in, that it only seems authentic if the individuals who are kind of putting it forward, presenting the pattern, the biodynamic farmer, whatever. It's much more authentic if it feels like the people distributing the message are not doing it for the self-aggrandizement, like in Murdoch's comment, the artist who's trying to be the famous painter.
Sure.
That doesn't work. And Peterson obviously is writing a book, and sort of there was a period of the book tour. But you go into all those early lectures, or you just don't get the sense that he's laying out the map to make himself a superstar.
Yeah, he's
like
just
I'm going to map
out.
Yeah, I'm going to map out like these layers of meaning in the Bible. And those all kind of predating the stardom. And it's just, anyway, I just think there's another fascinating element of just kind of how he's been in the landscape, sort of presenting been a really powerful voice for this frame, this pattern.
Yeah.
And it feels like the people who, like Martin Luther King, the people who are kind of they're putting forward the quality pattern. You don't, like he says, we're going to make it to the promised land. I might not make it there with you, It's not about me being the rock star or the, superhero. They're just so driven by the actual message.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, don't judge people judge them by the content of their character. Drop all your presuppositions and your categories. And what is it? The most charitable
assumption.
The most charitable assumption.
And
Another variation of that.
When I was taking that class what is that? 18 years ago or something.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, that charitable assumption class, at the same time that I was reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Wow.
And that class was taught by a brother and a sister. And the sister had married the high school sweetheart and had, I think, 3 children, and they'd been happily married for 20 years, and everything was perfect. And the husband had had three marriages and all these divorces. And so it was the same thing. It was like kind of integrating the pattern in the class rather than here's this, teacher who's going to be the sole monopoly on the truth.
Yeah.
It was an interesting way to kind of, here's 2 of us with very different, life experiences together, sort of mapping the terrain and figuring out like, what is the same, regardless if your life seems kind of like idyllic or if your life seems like a train wreck, what can we agree on as far as what are the maps for, successful, interpersonal relationships.
Yeah.
And, that, like we were saying, trying to describe the situation in ultimately, in some form, I guess, objective way. Although after listening to Jonathan Pageau too much, it's very hard to deal with that word objective.
Yeah. It's got its utility, it's useful in certain circumstances, but I guess you could say there is, on a certain level, like the most basic level of human consciousness, there is this objective pattern. The pattern itself is what it's objective. And after that, how it manifests is going to be any of a million different ways. So I think it's tuning yourself into being able, like you're doing, with your spiritual practice, tuning yourself into being able to see the pattern before you see the manifestation.
How has, this journey that you've been on with Zen, how is that affecting you or changing you in your real life?
Well, it's like, it does make it a lot easier to have the lens of compassion, the most compassionate frame. I'm sorry, I forgot again. Say it again.
Charitable?
The charitable.
The most charitable assumption.
The most charitable assumption, I'm sorry. It does make it, because there's a certain, there's just so many ways to answer this question. There's something like the best of Buddhism in it, because it's inviting you. It seems to have the best of Buddhism and the best of Christianity for me, or at least two of the strongest elements integrated. One is that it puts you in that objective space of seeing in the moment what is reality. And then it has the more Western element, which is, and you are moving towards progress. So there's both that, there's that still Zen feminine element, and then there's the more dynamic masculine element, at least on a spiritual level. So it's very complete to me in that sense. That's one way of describing the completeness, but there's something about it that just puts me in that space, the space we're kind of referring to and we've been talking about.
And, you're can you describe like your kind of spiritual place now? Like we're both kind of on spiritual journeys, but I think they seem maybe they seem like atypical to me.
Yeah, and don't we both struggle a little bit with Christianity?
Yeah, I I definitely think there's the sense of insider, outsider,
Mm-hmm.
and that I yeah, I don't know how to describe it, but there is there is a sense that kind of approaching, looking at the world, using symbolically is not always like if you're a if you're seeing Christianity in the vein of a Pageau, and then I go to my local church, that language doesn't overlap a lot
Yeah.
with what they're talking about at the
Mm-hmm.
church. So while I'm there to participate in kind of the body of all these people, like when he confront Pageau and Peterson's comment that community is not, a group of your friends. This is all the variation in the society, including people who don't like you need to be there too.
Yeah.
The people who are not your fans, and that. So yeah, I go to the church. I attend the service. I get great value out of a lot of what's going on there, but the symbolic language isn't necessarily reflected in the specific church, where we were attending, because we were in a small town.
Yeah, you would really have to look for it. You'd have to, like, maybe even the readings or something. But yeah, it'd be difficult. Well, Richard, it's interesting, Richard Hemmer, who's in our meetup group, said that, even because I had made some remark in one of my videos that, I went there and you wouldn't necessarily be with the people who you would choose as friends. And he said, but there is something about that unity, unifying in community and being there for each other that's really valuable. That doesn't mean you have to be best friends.
And I think important linguistically to flip that a little bit too. Not just that you're going to the church with people that you wouldn't choose to be friends with, but that you're going to church with people who wouldn't choose you.
That's right.
But they choose you at church.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something very
Perfect,
ineffable and kind of perfect and magical that they might really just not it might not be their cup of tea, but at church there's something very beautiful and harmonious that happens.
Well, thanks. That's wonderful. Thanks for opening up that whole other side to that understanding. Now it's complete. Now it really makes sense.
Well, Richard was saying that about I hope I'm not oversharing on his experience, but he said he went to a Baptist service. Everybody was talking about who was saved and who wasn't saved, and how they were really worried about, like, my uncle that isn't saved, or this person's brother who isn't saved yet. And Richard was saying, if they knew that I'm not saved, and I don't think I'm saved in the way that they're talking about saved, so they might not accept me if they knew, so you kind of, it was just an illustration of how even in the community, people are responding to the language and the experience differently. And even one little aspect, like what exactly is salvation, and I, in my conversation with him, for me, salvation was coming to some of those forks and keep, periodically going the wrong way, and then taking a moment and kind of reorienting and saying, no, I'm going to really try to make a commitment here to go towards the light in these interactions. Yeah. And that's a kind of a salvation,
It may be exactly what salvation means.
Just saving me from myself.
Well, on that note, let's say good evening.
Sounds good.
And thank you so much, John. I really appreciated this conversation.
Yeah, thanks for hanging out. I always
so
appreciate
interesting to talk to. So I'll see you on Saturday at the meetup.
Sounds good. I'll see you then.
Chapter 18. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.